And we read this about Nehemiah, and here he is. He shows up, and from the very onslaught of him arriving, the enemy starts attacking. And I think it's incredible that in every season that we read him in this time period, Sanballat and Tobiah are relentless. And their one objective in Nehemiah 4, 5, and 6 is talking about the attacks of the enemy. I would encourage you to read through it in your own personal quiet time this week and just underline every time it talks about fear. Because every time they showed up, their one objective was to instill fear in Nehemiah and the Jewish people's hearts. In our lives, people often say that the opposite of faith is fear is faith, and that's not true. The opposite of fear is not faith, it's love. Everything in your life is either done out of the motive of love or it's done out of the motive of fear. And the enemy knows where there is fear, there is not love. So he wants us to begin to be fearful, and he does that by deceiving, discouraging, distracting, and distorting us. He comes in and tries to do these things because he wants us to get fearful so we'll retreat. He knows that if God's hand is on our life, there is nothing that we cannot do. He knows that if God's hand is upon us, then all of a sudden things are going to begin to change in our families, change in our culture, change in our society. So you know what he does? He shows up and he tries to deceive us, discourage us, distort us, and begin to change what we see God doing, and our focus is on what he's doing instead. And every time Sanballat and Tobiah showed up, their accusations were different, but the root of it was to instill fear. Charles Spurgeon says this: God had one son without sin, but he never had a son without a trial. As a son and a daughter of God, you're gonna go through trials. Let me just encourage you with this thing. Jesus said this: you will suffer trials. There is going to be tribulation. There are going to be times when you go after what God's called you to do, and every Sanballat and Tobiah are going to show up in your life. And it's in those seasons that you need to be aware of the enemy's tactics in your life. So there's 4 things that I believe that Nehemiah was under attack in this season. Number 1, Sanballat and Tobiah came to question their ability. We see this in the opening passage that we read today in Nehemiah 4, 1 through 3. He showed up and began to question their supplies, their motives, their talents, and their time. And the same is true with us. How many of us have had the enemy show up and question our time? Shouldn't you be further along than this by now? Shouldn't you have accomplished more than this by now? You're too old to go after this. Then when you're young, he says, you're too young to do this. It's amazing how our age, we're always not old enough or we're not young enough, right? Like he's always trying to use time against us. There's not enough time in the day. There's too much time, whatever it is. Or our supplies. He begins to ridicule the supplies they're building with, their talents, their ability. He begins to question their motives. And I think it's interesting because I will just say this: as I was preparing for this time together, I was on my run and the Lord just reminded me that, and I teach this in our college, is that a lot of times we have a hero complex when we read the Bible. Meaning that when we read the story of David and Goliath, we always script ourselves as David. We never script ourselves as Saul. And we never script ourselves as the Goliath. Because sometimes you're Goliath. You're the one taunting God's people. You're the one actually bringing an attack on God's people. You're not always David. I will just say that in this story, that as I was praying about it this morning, the Lord said, some of you, you're not Nehemiah, the one being attacked by Sanballat and Tobiah. You're actually Sanballat and Tobiah. You're the one that comes in and questions the person of God's motives. Questions their talents, questions their abilities. You come in and you bring accusations. And isn't it interesting that we want everybody else to believe the best about us, but we believe the worst about everybody else? And they come in every time and begin to try to tell Nehemiah what his true motive is. Try to tell Nehemiah what he's there for. But Nehemiah was like this. He said, you know what? You weren't there when God called me, and you're not going to be there to get a say in whether or not God called me. Quit allowing other people to have a vote and a say in what God's called you to do. It doesn't matter if people understand you. It doesn't matter if people think you're qualified. It doesn't matter if they think that you're called by God. If if God called you to do it, then that's enough. You don't need any kind of credentials. You don't need their backing. You don't need their Facebook like on your post. It was never between you and them anyways. I remember whenever I first started speaking, I got down from preaching and I was in Sulphur Springs at the time. And we did this terrible idea where we took Pastor Jimmy. We used to take all the first time guests. Instead of having them text, hey, we would say, hey, meet us in this room. So we take you to a room in the church, lock the doors behind us. And there we would give them a gift and ask them questions like, how did you like the service? Bad idea. Like, don't do that. That's not a great church growth strategy, okay? So I had gotten done speaking that Sunday. I had only communicated a few times at that point. And Pastor Terry at the time, he asked the first time guest, well, how did you like the service today? And he looked straight at me and he said, I thought it was good, but I'll never come back as long as she's holding the microphone. And Brian's dad goes, well, it looks like you're not coming back. And I say this to say that a lot of you, your story would stop there. And you've got to be okay that there's going to be people that don't think you're qualified. You got to get okay that there's going to be some people that want to see you fail. You're going to have to get okay that there are going to be some people that never understand you, that never support you, that never cheer you on. And you're okay to do it without their applause. You're okay to do it without their approval. You got to get to a season and a space and a time where it's okay. I wasn't doing this for you anyways. Are we okay? And you got to have that kind of like unction in your spirit, like that kind of fight inside of you. And Nehemiah was like, I'm fine to be questioned. I love this because Thomas Carlyle says this. He called ridicule the language of the devil. Some people who can stand bravely when they are shot at will collapse when they're laughed at. Shakespeare calls ridicule the paper bullets to the brain, but those bullets have slain many a warrior. I want to encourage you, be okay that people don't like you. Be okay that people don't support your decision.